Fossil Creek up near Strawberry. It's a popular summer destination, again, north of the valley. The feds are considering several changes there, including a ban on swimming at the main waterfall.
In the middle of the Arizona desert, there's a creek that shouldn't work. It runs the same volume of water every single hour of every single day. Even in drought, even in floods, at a nearly constant temperature, year-round. However, for 96 years, almost none of that water ever reached its own canyon. A dam swallowed all of that water. A network of wooden flumes carried it away. But then, in 2005, Arizona did something almost nobody in the American Southwest had ever done. Engineers shut the dam down, pulled the flumes apart, and gave the river its water back. What happened next didn't just restore a stream, it rewrote what scientists thought they knew about how fast a broken desert ecosystem could heal itself. So what exactly was lost at Fossil Creek? And why did the recovery move so much faster than anyone predicted? Let's dive in. The creek that never runs dry. Fossil Creek isn't a big river. It begins as a cluster of springs near the Mogollon Rim, where water suddenly emerges from the rock and forms the creek. From there, it runs for just 17 miles down to the Verde River. However, almost nothing about it behaves like a normal desert stream. The springs release roughly 20,000 gallons every minute. That's about 43 cubic feet of water every second, hour after hour, day after day. And remarkably, that flow stays almost the same through droughts and floods, with the water remaining around 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit all year. In a state where many rivers disappear by midsummer, that kind of consistency is almost unheard of. And as it moves through the limestone beneath the Mogollon Rim, it picks up large amounts of dissolved calcium carbonate. So by the time it reaches the surface, the water isn't just carrying minerals, it's carrying the ingredients to build rock. When the water slows down and meets the open air, that dissolved calcium carbonate begins turning back into solid stone. That stone is called travertine, and Fossil Creek doesn't simply carry travertine downstream, it builds with it. Around 13 tons of fresh travertine are deposited along the creek every single day. The mineral hardens around fallen logs and leaves, builds up along the edges of the current, and gradually creates natural terraces across the stream. Those terraces slow the water even more, creating pool after pool of bright turquoise water. Over thousands of years, this process helps turn Fossil Creek into the fourth largest travertine-forming system in the United States. And that constant flow creates something else: life. Fossil Creek has created one of the most biologically rich corridors in Arizona. More than 30 species of trees and shrubs grow along its banks, while more than 100 species of birds move through the canyon every year. And people had been here for a very long time, too. Archaeologists have found evidence of human presence in the watershed going back nearly 10,000 years. The Yavapai and Apache peoples who lived here still regard the canyon as ancestral ground. For thousands of years, this simple system remained almost unchanged. Water flowed from the springs. Minerals in the water built stone. The stone formed pools, and those pools supported life. Until one man decided to change all that flow and turn this endless natural system into a source of power, claiming the waters. In 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner filed a claim on Fossil Creek. A year later, he claimed the springs and headwaters themselves. At the time, nearby mining towns like Jerome, Clarkdale, and Crown King were growing fast and desperately needed electricity. And Fossil Creek had exactly what they were looking for: a water source that never stopped flowing. What followed after the claim was one of the strangest construction projects in Arizona history. The creek sat in a remote location, The nearest railroad stop was more than 40 miles away, across mountains and canyon country with no road connecting it to Fossil Creek. So the crews had to build one. More than 400 mules and 600 men hauled over 150 wagons loaded with turbines, cement, and other equipment along a trail carved through the rough terrain. It was dangerous work. Men and animals died along the trail. But the project continued. And after years of hard work, on June 21, 1909, the Childs Power Plant finally came online. 3 Pelton wheel turbines began generating around 6,700 kilowatts of electricity. But the engineers soon realized one plant wouldn't be enough, so they built another. Between 1915 and 1916, a second smaller plant called Irving was built, adding another 1,560 kilowatts. Now, the engineers had the power plants. They needed to divert the water. So engineers built roughly 8,800 feet of concrete channels to carry the water away from the creek. And all of this was controlled by a 25-foot dam near the springs, which captured almost the entire flow of Fossil Creek and sent it toward the power plants. The system worked. By 1920, the Childs and Irving plants together supplied roughly 70% of the electricity powering the rapidly growing city of Phoenix. Homes, businesses, factories, all of them were being powered by water that had emerged from a limestone canyon more than 100 miles away. It was a remarkable feat of engineering. In 1976, the plants were named a historic mechanical engineering landmark. Then, in 1991, they were added to the National Register of Historic Places. However, while the turbines were quietly powering the entire city, the creek below the dam had slowly started to disappear. The disappearing creek, with almost the entire flow diverted into the concrete channels, the creek was left with almost nothing. Sometimes, the natural stream bed carried just 1 or 2 cubic feet of water per second, compared to the 43 cubic feet per second the creek was naturally producing. And that changed everything. The travertine formation that had been building stone for thousands of years almost completely stopped. The turquoise pools began to shrink, and then the fish started disappearing. Native species like the round-tailed chub, speckled dace, Sonora sucker, and desert sucker had evolved specifically for this stream. But now, they were being pushed into a fraction of the habitat they once had. And as the native fish lost ground, something else moved in. Non-native fish. They were better suited to the slower, warmer water and began competing with the native species for food and habitat, and even preying on them. The entire ecosystem was collapsing, and you can see just how different Fossil Creek had become by comparing it with descriptions from the past. Historical accounts from the late 1800s described the creek constantly building its own pools, with one glowing turquoise basin after another stretching through the canyon. You couldn't see the same endless chain of turquoise pools anymore. The creek was still there, but it was no longer the river it had once been. But by the late 1990s, something started to change. The hydroelectric plants were old, and compared with a modern power grid, the amount of electricity they produced had become relatively small. Meanwhile, environmental groups were pointing to what had happened to the creek. The wetlands were shrinking, the travertine formations were disappearing, and native fish populations were moving closer to local extinction. So the utility that owned the plants now had a choice to make: keep an aging power system running or give Fossil Creek its water back. And what happened next would become one of the most unusual environmental decisions in American history. The unusual decision. In 1999, Arizona Public Service agreed to do something almost unheard of in a region where water is one of the most contested resources. It agreed to shut down both power plants and give Fossil Creek its water back. And this wasn't something a court forced them to do. This was restoration simply because the river itself was worth saving. This was also the second time in United States history that a dam had been dismantled purely for environmental reasons. The first had happened just 6 years earlier with the removal of Edwards Dam in Maine. But Fossil Creek was different. The Maine project had opened a migration route for fish with real commercial and recreational value. Fossil Creek had almost none of those valuable fish. And the dismantling itself wasn't cheap. The initial price tag was around $13 million. Once the full decade of phased dismantling and monitoring was included, the cost moved closer to $17 million. At the shutdown ceremony, Vincent Randall, a Yavapai Apache tribal historian and councilman, stood at the edge of the canyon where his ancestors had once helped build the dam. His people had been part of that history. But now, Randall said, its time had passed. The Yavapai Apache Nation had supported the decommissioning, hoping to see the creek's sacred waters flowing freely again for future generations. But after all this dismantling, there was still one problem. You can't simply turn the water back on and expect a broken river to fix itself. The creek was crowded with non-native fish, and the moment the full flow returned, those fish could multiply quickly, overwhelming the native species. So, in the fall of 2004, roughly 100 people moved into the stream. They worked alongside the U.S. Forest Service, Arizona Game and Fish, and scientists from Northern Arizona University. First, they removed the invasive fish. Then, they built a barrier to stop new ones from swimming back upstream. They also rescued the native fish that remained, so they could later be returned to the creek. By the time the work was finished, researchers led by ecologist Dr. Jane Marks had their equipment ready in the creek, both upstream and downstream. They had already spent years measuring the damaged section, so now they were ready to record exactly what would change when the water returned. Everything was ready. Now there was only one thing left: wait and watch. The water comes back. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut off the water channels that were diverting the flow of Fossil Creek. For the first time since 1909, Fossil Creek's full natural flow was allowed to return to its canyon. However, the water didn't come rushing back. It crept downstream, slowly filling the nooks, pools, and side channels one by one, while Marks and a crowd of scientists and locals stood along the banks and watched. By the end of the day, something remarkable had happened. The creek had gone from just 1 or 2 cubic feet per second to as much as 50 cubic feet per second. For the first time, a desert stream in the American Southwest was being given back its complete natural flow, and nobody knew exactly what would happen next. The research team had expected the creek would take decades to recover. Some models suggested it could take even longer, but they were wrong. The first changes appeared almost immediately. Within a few months, photosynthesis in the stream increased, and the creek's ability to process nutrients returned to levels seen in the healthy reaches upstream. And the recovery didn't stop there. 6 months later, even the invertebrate population that had been devastated by the chemical treatment used to remove the invasive fish had already recovered. And the deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. The creek wasn't simply surviving, it was rebuilding itself. It was turning back into stone. For decades, travertine formation in the starved sections of Fossil Creek had almost completely stopped. But once the flow returned, the rock building process started again almost immediately. Along a 6-mile stretch below the springs, new travertine dams began forming. Some were growing by more than 2 centimeters every year. The turquoise pools that had once defined the canyon began filling and deepening again. For thousands of years, Fossil Creek had been building itself out of water. Now, after nearly a century of interruption, it was doing it again. But even after the water, the travertine, and the invertebrates began to return, researchers still had one major question. Would the native fish come back too? The return of native fish. With the invasive fish gone, the barrier holding, and the full flow restored, the native fish that had been clinging to survival for nearly a century didn't just recover. They exploded. The Sonora sucker population increased roughly 17-fold. The desert sucker climbed around 52-fold. Then came the round-tailed chub, a fish that had been edging toward local extinction. Its population increased roughly 70-fold. And finally, the speckled dace. This small native minnow had nearly disappeared from the canyon. After the restoration, its numbers increased by roughly 150-fold. Think about that. A population that had been close to disappearing came back more than 100 times over in just a few years. But the numbers tell only part of the story. These fish had evolved in Fossil Creek, shaped by its specific chemistry, temperature, and flow. For nearly a century, that isolation had made them vulnerable. Now, that same isolation was helping protect them. The barrier built in 2004 kept non-native fish from moving back upstream, giving the native species a chance to recover in the stream where they had evolved. And the recovery didn't stop with those 4 species. Today, Fossil Creek is home to 9 native fish species. It also holds a distinction that no other stretch of river in Arizona can match. It is the longest reach of river in the state where the native fish community is completely free of non-native species. But the fish were only one part of the comeback. The restored corridor now supports somewhere near 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And around the springs, the recovery becomes even more impressive. In the roughly 50-acre botanical area surrounding the springs, researchers have cataloged 166 species of plants. So think about where this started. A creek that had been slowly dying below a century-old dam had become one of the richest pockets of life in the entire Southwest. But once the news of this recovery spread, something else happened. People wanted to see the creek for themselves. And that's when the people protecting Fossil Creek suddenly started to face a new problem. The next threat arrives. In 2009, Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river. That made it one of only 2 stretches of water in all of Arizona with that protection. But protecting the river created a new problem. People wanted to see it. The clear, warm, turquoise water in the middle of the high desert proved almost impossible to resist. Thousands of visitors began pouring into the canyon every year, and the pressure started to show. People trampled the banks. Trash was left behind, and the ecosystem that had taken years to rebuild was now being strained by the people coming to enjoy it. A river that had survived a full-scale hydroelectric system was now facing a completely different threat. So, the Forest Service had to act. It introduced a tighter system of permits and reservations to limit how many people could enter the canyon each day. After spending years saving Fossil Creek from being drained dry, its stewards now had a new job. They had to save it from being loved to death. But the visitors weren't the only surprise. The recovery itself was creating changes nobody had expected. As the travertine began forming again at full strength, It started coating anything that stayed still in the water long enough. Even invasive crayfish were being slowly covered in layers of mineral. And then, scientists noticed something even stranger. Those same non-native crayfish appeared to be keeping native invertebrate populations in check in ways researchers were still trying to understand. It was another reminder that restoring a river isn't as simple as turning the water back on. Fossil Creek wasn't just coming back. It was becoming a completely new scientific experiment. And what scientists learned from Fossil Creek didn't stay in Arizona. Researchers studying larger and more complicated dam removals are also looking to Fossil Creek for answers. One example is the massive effort now underway on the Klamath River in California and Oregon. They have pointed back to Fossil Creek as proof that ecosystems can recover faster than models predict. Scientists have also learned something more valuable from this recovery. Restoring the flow helped. Removing invasive species helped. But doing both together produced results that neither step could achieve on its own. Fossil Creek became a working blueprint for dam removals across the American West. And that matters because thousands of aging, obsolete dams still sit on rivers across the country. Each one raises the same question Arizona faced in 1999. Is it still worth keeping? The financial numbers also tell another part of the story. It cost roughly $13 million to decommission the two power plants. By the 1990s, they were producing only a small fraction of the electricity Phoenix depended on. But look at what came back: 9 native fish species, nearly 200 species of vertebrates, 166 plant species in a single 50-acre area, and a travertine system rebuilding itself at a rate of centimeters per year. So, here we are, a creek that had been quietly strangled for 96 years, turned out to hold one of the fastest, most complete ecological recoveries ever documented in the American Southwest. So, if a river can recover this quickly after nearly a century of damage, how many other rivers are still waiting for the same chance? And with thousands of aging dams still standing across the country, should more of them come down? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want more incredible stories about the wild, unlikely comebacks happening across America, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.